Welcome back to the deep dive. We've gathered a stack of your sources, and we're going deep on a topic that, well, seen through this particular lens, it might just shift how you think about it. Prayer.
Hmm.
And not just, personal quiet prayer. We're looking specifically at its role in strategic leadership effectiveness, often in Christian contexts from these sources.
That's right. Our mission here really is to unpack the core arguments these texts are making. And they challenge a pretty common myth, suggesting prayer isn't this passive, secondary thing.
Right.
Instead, they frame it as, well, a dynamic, even strategic force, maybe even fundamental to how we define success.
So yeah, forget the idea of prayer as just spiritual garnish or, the last resort when nothing else works.
Exactly.
According to these sources, we're exploring prayer as a kind of engine. An engine for clarity, for courage, for driving real change. It's about understanding why they argue it might be a missing link.
Okay, so let's dig into that core myth first. It's pretty pervasive, isn't it? This idea that prayer is, soft or passive, disconnected from the tangible stuff we usually focus on, the planning, the metrics, the execution. It often gets pushed aside as maybe personal comfort, but not really part of the real work.
And these sources, they push back hard on that. They basically call it a critical blind spot.
They do.
They argue prayer is not passive, it's actually transformative power, a cornerstone, they say, of proactive, intentional leadership. They position it as a strategic asset.
Exactly. And they pose the question, why is this so crucial now? We live in this era of just immense complexity, rapid change, and leadership that only looks at the visible metrics while it's missing a whole dimension, according to these texts. They argue that engaging the spiritual dimension through prayer can actually fortify vision, build resilience, maybe even unlock innovation in ways purely secular approaches might miss.
So it's tapping into a different kind of power source for clarity, courage.
Precisely.
Okay, so if it's not passive, what is it then? The sources use some really vivid, almost physical imagery from the Bible.
They do. It's striking.
Things like a forge, a hammer striking metal, wrestling, contending, even taking a warrior's stance. It sounds much less like quiet reflection and more like, well, hard work, vigorous exertion.
That's where it gets really interesting. These texts highlight biblical figures known for intense engagement through prayer. You've got Moses. The sources don't describe him politely asking.
No.
They frame it more like an all-out spiritual campaign, pleading intensely for Israel back in Exodus 32.
Or Nehemiah. I found that fascinating. He wasn't just praying after things went wrong.
Right.
He strategically paused this massive rebuilding project to fast and petition God. Before, during. It shows prayer woven right into the action, shaping, kingdom-level outcomes.
The intensity is just palpable in these descriptions. They point to Elijah on Mount Carmel, that famous scene in 1 Kings 18.
Calling down fire, yeah.
Described here as a high-stakes showdown, a lung-busting, heart-pounding call. It clearly wasn't some casual request. It was dramatic, full of faith, a real confrontation.
And that image of Jacob wrestling at the Jabbok in Genesis 32, that story just shatters the whole passive idea, doesn't it?
Completely.
It's a spiritual struggle, so intense, so real. It leaves him physically changed. It's about this deep, demanding engagement that reshapes his whole identity, his destiny.
Yes, and even people around the leaders. Paul mentions Epaphras in Colossians 4.1, saying he's always wrestling prayer for the Colossians. That word, agonizomai, it's like an athletic contest.
Wow.
It implies struggle, perseverance, striving.
Okay, and Daniel too, right. Praying 3 times a day, defying a royal edict. That took serious courage.
Absolutely. Unwavering commitment in the face of danger. And Joshua at Jericho, 40 days of marching, praying, speaking decrees. It's this fusion of faith and action, projecting divine authority.
Paul even talks about struggling not against flesh and blood, but spiritual forces in Ephesians 6. Prayer as engaging these invisible realms, like a scout, or artillery, or even the command center.
It all emphasizes this idea of partnership. Prayer, in this view, it isn't a one-sided monologue.
Or just pleading from the sidelines.
Exactly. It's presented as actively co-laboring with the Creator. A dynamic process that, according to these sources, genuinely influences reality.
Which, naturally, leads to the big question our modern analytical minds jump to. Okay, how do you measure that?
Right. How do you quantify this dynamic contest, this invisible force?
And the sources, to their credit, they're upfront about the difficulty. The effects they describe, softened hearts, moments of divine wisdom, shifts in atmosphere, they're often intangible.
Very much so. And they identify some pitfalls we fall into when we try to squeeze prayer into our usual measurement boxes.
Like what?
Well, one is over-rationalizing it, trying to turn prayer into a formula, a checklist, like putting coins in a vending machine and expecting a guaranteed result.
The vending machine approach, yeah, I
Yeah.
see that.
Or getting fixated on outcomes, judging prayer only by immediate, tangible results. These texts suggest that mindset breeds cynicism when things don't happen on our schedule or exactly as we expect.
And maybe overlooking the inner work, focusing only on changing the outside situation. But missing that prayer is also meant to fundamentally change us, the person praying.
That's a huge part of it. They use some helpful analogies, though, like wind or gravity.
Okay.
You don't see the force itself, right? But you absolutely see the effects, trees moving, planets staying in orbit.
Sure.
Likewise, prayer is described here as this invisible force with visible consequences. Maybe sudden clarity in a complex mess, or softened animosity between colleagues, or totally unexpected opportunities just opening up.
The biblical perspective they bring in also emphasizes hidden growth, like the kingdom being hidden, as Jesus said in Luke 17, or faith being conviction about unseen realities, like in Hebrews 11, or that farmer in James 5, patiently waiting for the unseen roots to grow before the harvest shows up.
Exactly. The fruit of prayer, as they describe it, often unfolds slowly, weeks, months, sometimes years. It requires a different kind of observation.
So, if the usual spreadsheets and scorecards fall short, how do we gauge effectiveness from this perspective? The sources argue we need to sort of recalibrate, look for new metrics.
Yeah, new metrics. And these are often centered on, well, heart-level indicators.
Like what kind of indicators?
Are you seeing resistance soften? Maybe an employee finally admits a mistake without defensiveness, or a friend starts moving toward forgiveness.
Yeah.
Are new ideas or initiatives popping up that feel genuinely spirit-led, rooted in compassion, not just profit?
Okay.
Is there a noticeable increase in peace, even when things are chaotic? A sharper clarity of vision, a renewed sense of purpose filtering through a team, or just a growing conviction, a heightened spiritual sensitivity in yourself or others?
Interesting. So less about numbers, more about these qualitative shifts.
And also looking at community rhythms, things like corporate testimonies, people actually sharing stories of these unseen shifts they're noticing. Or using prayer journals, not just for requests, but to trace those subtle leadings over time. And the tangible impact when people pray together in unity, like we see in Acts 4 or 12, there's a different energy there.
And cultural transformation, too, like seeing values lived out.
Exactly. Observing things like greater empathy, more consistent ethical choices, deeper resilience showing up in how a team or organization operates, or even just the longevity of commitment, less burnout, more stamina. These are seen as the fruits that ripen over time.
So how do you cultivate sensitivity to these less obvious things?
The sources suggest practical steps, intentional practices like building in silence, stillness, meditating on scripture, doing regular, maybe weekly prayer retrospectives, looking back and asking, where did we sense God moving? What shifted?
Like a review meeting, but for prayer.
Sort of. And celebrating those small, sometimes invisible wins, acknowledging them builds momentum and awareness.
Okay, this makes sense. It connects to how the strategic view of prayer actually translates into practice, into leadership. It's not prayer instead of planning.
No, absolutely not. It's framed as prayer and planning. Integration is key.
That Nehemiah example again in chapter 4, it seems crucial.
It's the blueprint they constantly point back to. Faced with enemies, he didn't just pray. He didn't just build walls and post guards. He did both simultaneously.
Prayed to our God and posted a guard.
Exactly. Prayer energized and directed his very practical, very tactical planning. It wasn't separate.
So pulling from these texts, it seems like there are maybe 5 essential elements for this kind of holistic, strategic prayer life they're describing.
Yeah, you could break it down like that. First, what they call wise planning.
Okay.
It starts before the action. Seeking God's vision first. Asking, what is your heart for this project, this situation, this team? Then developing prayer action plans, not just action plans.
Like Solomon asking for wisdom, or Paul changing plans based on guidance?
Precisely those kinds of examples. Seeking divine insight into the plan. Second, coordinated intercession.
Moving beyond just praying alone.
Right. Establishing prayer teams, maybe defining roles, sharing objectives clearly. Moving from solo echoes, as they put it, to a roaring chorus. Like the early church praying together in Acts 4, or specifically for Peter's release in Acts 12. There's power in coordinated focus.
Okay, third.
Constant evaluation. Regularly looking at those new metrics we talked about. Actively listening for course corrections. Seeing prayer not as a one-time request, but an ongoing dialogue.
Like Moses at the tent of meeting, always checking in.
Exactly. Or Solomon, inquiring of God, Paul assessing his own progress. It's a posture of continual seeking and adjustment. Some sources even suggest practical tools, like a prayer journal with maybe 3 columns. Petition, perception, what you sense God saying or doing, and pivot how you need to adjust based on that perception.
Petition, perception, pivot. I like that. What's fourth?
Accountable leadership. This is crucial. Leaders have to model this commitment to prayer themselves.
Lead by example.
Yes, and actively facilitate the coordination among prayer teams. Steward the follow-through on insights gained. It means really elevating prayer to a core leadership function.
They mention examples like Moses and the elders, Ezra's teams, the early church appointing deacons partly to free up leaders for prayer.
Exactly. It might mean defining specific roles. A prayer coordinator, team leads, prayer partners, whatever fits the context.
Okay, and the fifth element?
Enduring persistence. Just embracing the long view. Patiently sowing season after season. Understanding this is often an unseen campaign that unfolds over time.
Like James's farmer waiting for the harvest?
Or Jacob wrestling all night. Joseph's journey decades. Anna the prophetess waiting faithfully in the temple for years. It requires sustainable rhythms, not burnout sprints, and anchoring yourself in community for that long-haul support.
The sources mention some stories, brief examples to make these points concrete, right?
Yeah, they do sprinkle in illustrations, like Clara, a project manager, who started doing these short 5-minute prayer huddles before key meetings.
What?
She noticed tension diffusing, and apparently productivity actually climbed. Or Raphael, a high school principal who held a prayer strategy week, focused on dropout rates. He gained insights that led to practical changes, improving attendance and even teacher retention, according to the source.
Wow. So direct links.
And others, Leah, a tech leader, finding creative solutions at dissolving team tensions through a prayer power hour. Dr. Miriam, in healthcare, seeing staff resilience rise and better protocols emerge after war room prayer sessions. These anecdotes illustrate prayer impacting tangible outcomes.
Maria, a nonprofit leader, finding culturally relevant ideas through a prayer listening post. Dr. Lena seeing ward resilience improve with seasonal prayer cycles. Sarah boosting donor engagement with a prayer and purpose initiative. Dr. Malik finding stable funding by combining prayer and planning. Even a coalition seeing reduced homelessness linked to long-term prayer and service.
These stories, though concise in the sources, paint a picture of prayer as an active ingredient, not just a background wish.
But it's not foolproof, right? The sources also warn about pitfalls, like prayer being distorted.
Oh, absolutely. It's presented as powerful, but like any power, it can be misunderstood or misused. They highlight 4 main pitfalls.
Okay, what's the first?
Over-spiritualizing without action. They call it the prayer blanket mentality.
Believing prayer just replaces the hard work of planning and execution.
Exactly. Believing you could just pray and not do anything else. They strongly counter this with James 2:17, faith without works is dead. And they point back to Nehemiah 4 again, prayer and action. Always both.
Got it. Pitfall 2.
Presumption of results. That's the vending machine view we touched on earlier.
Expecting prayer formula, desired outcome. Guaranteed.
Right. And the counterexample they use is powerful. Jesus in Gethsemane. His prayer wasn't about getting his preferred outcome, but aligning with the Father's will, not my will, but yours be done. And Habakkuk 2.3 reminds us that God's vision often has an appointed time. We have to wait for it.
Okay, third pitfall.
Self-centered intercession. The me-only monologue.
Just praying about my own needs, my own problems.
Pretty much. Limiting prayer just to yourself or your immediate circle. The sources cite 1 Timothy 2, urging prayer for all people, for leaders, for everyone. And Daniel 9 is held up as an example. Daniel praying for the corporate destiny of his people, not just his own safety.
Makes sense. And the fourth one?
Legalistic ritualism. The duty-driven drill.
Just going through the motions, checking the prayer box.
Exactly. Reducing prayer to a rote task, done without heart, without genuine engagement. They point to Isaiah 1, where God says he despises empty, meaningless rituals, and Matthew 6, where Jesus warns against babbling on with empty phrases. God knows what you need.
So the safeguards are about integration action with prayer, submission to God's timing, expanding who you pray for, and keeping it heart-centered, not just ritual.
Precisely. That Dr. Malik story is a good example of that. Again, he overcame the over-spiritualizing pitfall by integrating prayer with strategic planning for preventative care. That led to stability and success.
This leads to a really powerful final point in these sources, doesn't it? If effectiveness isn't just about the external results, what's the ultimate proof of prayer's power?
Yeah, this is profound. They argue the deepest evidence is the transformation of the person praying.
Back to the forge imagery, prayer shaping character.
Exactly. Refining you from the inside out.
Hmm.
Jesus' own life is presented as the model.
Yeah.
Yes, amazing miracles flowed from his connection with the Father, but the ultimate miracle, in a sense, was his perfect obedience, his complete alignment, his at one-ment with the Father's will, shown most clearly in Gethsemane. Effectiveness, viewed this way, isn't just measured by outcomes, but by the unwavering faith, the growing compassion, the resolute love that gets forged in that crucible of prayer.
So those spiritual indicators we talked about, the peace, clarity, purpose, shifts in atmosphere, growing conviction.
They aren't just side effects. According to these texts, they are tangible signs of that inner transformation taking place, and that inner change then ripples outward into your work, your relationships, your world. The Sarah nonprofit story, linking internal shifts to donor engagement, hints at this.
Okay, so let's connect this directly to you, the listener, thinking about everything we've unpacked from these sources. What does this perspective on prayer mean for you, for your work, your leadership roles, your personal goals?
It really does prompt some reflection, doesn't it? For instance, where in your own life, maybe a work project, a family challenge, a personal dream, might you be defaulting to what feels more like passive quiet time instead of engaging in the kind of active, wrestling, strategic prayer these sources describe?
And how are you currently measuring effectiveness in your job, your life? Are you maybe overlooking or undervaluing those unseen indicators, the heart shifts, the growing peace, the clarity that these sources suggest are the deeper, truer fruit?
If prayer really is, as presented here, the bedrock of strategy, how would starting your next big plan, your next initiative, with focused strategic prayer actually change your approach? What would that look like practically for you?
Think about a wall you're facing right now, something that feels completely stuck. How might intentionally applying this Nehemiah model, that fusion of prayer and action, potentially unlock a different path forward, maybe reveal a different kind of outcome than you've been aiming for?
And maybe challenge some core beliefs you hold about success. Do you subconsciously value action over intercession? Do you find yourself expecting prayer to work like a formula? How does this perspective invite you to see success and prayer's role in achieving it in a new light?
The core message we've distilled from this stack of sources today is pretty challenging, really. Prayer isn't passive. It's presented as strategic, vigorous, transformative.
A force, not just a tool for change, but potentially an engine that drives deep, lasting change both inside you and in the world around you.
It leaves us with a final thought to mull over, drawn from these texts. What if the roar of victory you seek, the results you're chasing, isn't just found out there in the execution, but actually begins with the strategic, consistent work you do right here at the internal anvil of prayer?
It's an invitation, really, an invitation from these sources to step into that process, to perhaps wield prayer not just as a moment of quiet, but like that blacksmith's hammer, allowing your own character, your communities, maybe even your world, to be forged anew.